they're planning to crash the economy. You got the debt ceiling coming. You got all this wild stuff, another tax cut. They want to crash the economy. I'm telling you, hang on to your seat. It's going to get wild. Democrats are warning, signaling a warning, and I posted this over at Daily Kos as well. Democrats are pointing out that Trump's threats to increase our national debt by as much as $7 trillion, that is the cost of another round of tax cuts for billionaires, shift billions of Treasury dollars into crypto, and impose tariffs on imported goods. Any one of those three things could cause an economic crash. All three of them might be a perfect storm. And Trump seems unconcerned. And the Republicans, they're meeting down at his shabby Doral Golf Club down in Florida today, right now, to plot what they're going to do. They don't seem to worry either. Now, to the average person, the idea of a recession is pretty grim. I mean, millions of people lose their jobs. People have to sell their 401ks at a loss out of desperation just to pay the rent and buy food. It's a horror show for average people, particularly in a country where 54% of Americans right now live paycheck to paycheck. So why isn't Trump worried about this? Why are Republicans not worried about this? Why are the billionaires who put Trump and the Republicans in power not worried about this? Well, the reason is very simple. There's three big benefits to billionaires to having an economic crash. It's why Reagan had a crash. It's why Bush had a crash. There's actually a benefit to them. First, it's a great excuse to cut government services, and also to cut taxes on billionaires. You just say, hey, we need to cut taxes to stimulate the economy. We need to cut government services because there's no money to pay for them. I mean, Reagan did this in '81. George W. Bush did this in 2002. So the second reason is that times of economic crisis increase the tolerance for strongman governments. FDR ran a strongman government. Now, it was one that everybody liked, but he was just, stomping all over Congress and doing things with executive orders that Republicans were screaming were unconstitutional. People were freaked out. They wanted a strong government. In Europe, Hitler used the Great Depression as the rationale for his enabling acts, which gave him rule by decree. And it appears now that Trump has rule by decree. I mean, he just fired these IGs in violation of the law, these inspector generals. I'll get into that more later on in the program, but he's defying the law or refusing to enforce the law in other cases right now, right in front of us, right in front of God and the world, and nobody is doing anything about it, and he's getting away with it. And that promises that more will come, and it'll get worse and worse and worse as time goes on. So, secondly, times of economic crisis, increase the need or the demand for strongman government. And in fact, this is where it's getting wild. 58% of young people, Generation Z people in the United States, say they trust social media more than traditional news. 45% now believe women have gained too many rights. The number of young men who believe that women have too much power in the United States has increased from 32 to 45% in just 5 years, while 52% say they trust what they readers see on social media. And then third, and this is the big reason, billionaires love economic crashes. I remember sitting in Gloria Swanson's apartment back in the 1980s having dinner with her, and she was on the board of our children's village. And, every 6 months or so, I'd go down to New York and we'd have dinner together in her apartment. And she would just tell me these wild stories. And she told me this story. She was a vegetarian and I was a vegetarian. And the program we ran was vegetarian. So we had this commonality. So anyhow, she told me this story about Joe Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father. And how he was her manager for a while. He was her lover for a while. And he robbed her blind. He ripped her off terribly. But her story about him was that when the Great Depression started, he had bailed out of the market just a week or two before the crash happened. And that during the crash, as the market was going down, Joe Kennedy, who was really, really rich, was buying stocks. Why? Because it's a buying opportunity. If you're really rich, when the stock market crashes, and all the little people are desperately selling all their stock just to pay for their rent and their food, you can buy that stock at a discount, and suddenly you're the richest person on earth. Joe Kennedy made a fortune doing this, as did J. Paul Getty. He left his parents' golden anniversary in 1929 to run down to Wall Street to buy stocks during the collapse, and ended up one of the richest men in the world. In fact, the richest man in the world. He said it was the opportunity of a lifetime to get oil companies for practically nothing, which is exactly what he did. And this is what we saw this during the Bush crash, right? During the Bush crash in 2007, home prices dropped 21%. This was when, there's millions of homes now owned by big corporations, hedge funds and big corporations out of New York, investment vehicles. This was when most of them were purchased, or many of them. Over 10 million Americans lost their homes to predators like Steve Mnuchin. The stock market lost over 50% during the Bush crash. Its all-time peak was on October 9th, 2007 at 14,164. It collapsed to 6,594. While 8 million Americans lost their jobs and were wiped out, the billionaires came in and started buying stocks that were being unloaded by working class people from their 401ks, even though they had to pay a penalty. Between 2009 and 2012, the bottom of the Bush crash and the beginning of the real recovery, the top 1% of Americans saw their income grow by over 31%. 95% of all income gains during that period were the top 1%. The S&P went up 462% by 2020. If you had invested in 2009 $1 billion, just 11 years later, you would have $4.6 billion. And then they did it again 10 years later during the Trump COVID crash. And this was, again, the billionaires became insanely wealthy. And they don't have to pay taxes on this money. I mean, just that 1 year, 2020, the world's billionaires saw their wealth increase by a full 54%. So here you've got Republicans down at Doral planning what they're going to do, economically, governmentally, whatever, and how they're not going to hold Trump accountable for impounding money. I'll get to that, in violation of the 1974 Impoundment Act. And they're planning to crash the economy. You got the debt ceiling coming. You got all this wild stuff, another tax cut. They want to crash the economy. I'm telling you, hang on to your seat. It's going to get wild.